I'll welcome everybody to our soil seminar this week. We had a fantastic turnout last week, and it looks like it's going to be a pretty good turnout this week as well. Before we get going, I'll just want to remind everybody that we are recording the seminars, so that will happen, and definitely feel free to use the chat box. We'll try to monitor that if you have questions throughout the seminar, so you can use that chat box for that. I'm excited today to welcome Dr. Erik Brevik to our seminar. He is going to give us a talk on an overview of soil science history with some Iowa State highlights. Now, Dr. Brevik teaches courses in geology and soil science at Dickinson State University. He coordinates the environmental science degree program, and he advises undergraduate research. He has taught at Valdosta State University and Dickinson State University during his faculty career. Dr. Brevik's research interests include combining information from soil science and geology, soil genesis, and the impact of humans on soil properties and processes, as well as soil science history, education, and links between soil science and culture. And with that, again, I want to welcome Dr. Erik Brevik, and I will turn it over to him.
Thank you very much, Matt. And we'll get the proper screen up here, hopefully, on this go round. Yes, and as Matt mentioned, I'm at Dickinson State University right now, but I did pop up. You'll notice on my cover slide here, I've got DSU on there, and I've got Iowa State on there as well. I am an alum of Iowa State University, and so I'm also a little small part of the college's history, and I'm not going to talk about myself today in terms of that and the historical side of things, but talking about history, and I'm a little piece of it from the group there at Iowa State University. So starting off, let's see here, get it to go. There we go. So I'm just going to do a kind of a brief run through, very broad, of soil science history, starting very early on and coming up to the current. And then I'm going to highlight just a few people, not very many in terms of the university as a whole, but a few people from Iowa State or with connections to Iowa State who have been significant in the history of soil science. So we're going to start off by going back to the very early days, and we find evidence of soil management that goes back actually thousands of years. We can find evidence of tillage of soils going all the way back to about 9,000 BCE, which is 11,000 years ago. We find this evidence in Iran, and of course, or I'm sorry, in Iraq, and of course, tillage is a very important part of preparing soils for agricultural production. Also, irrigation, a very long history. We find very early evidences of irrigation in Iraq as well, almost as far back as the tillage. And this makes a lot of sense for a region where it can be quite dry, but we do have rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates that provide a ready water source and allow the manipulation of that soil environment to allow plant growth in places that might otherwise not have the water available to do so. We go to Egypt, and back about 4,000 years ago, we have evidence of animal pooled seed drills. And this isn't a seed drill in this particular picture here. And of course, that's not from 4,000 years ago, that particular picture. But there are still places in the world today where agriculture is practiced with animal assistance and with tools that aren't that different from some of the things that you might have seen in these very early days of soil management. Classification of soils. The Chinese go all the way back to about 4,000 years ago with developing classifications. And even here in North America, we can look at evidence, archaeological evidence that shows that we had cultivation of crops happening, right here around us in certain parts of what is the modern day United States, going back somewhere around 7,000 years. So, we look at all these things, and of course, these do not necessarily indicate that we have a formal and distinct field of soil science that is in place at this point in time, but we do see lots of evidence of people who are working with the soil, modifying the soil, doing things that are going to make that soil more productive. They're going to provide better crop yield in these environments. And obviously, soil management is one very important part of even our modern soil science world. So they maybe weren't looking at the soils very specifically and very scientifically at this point in time, but there is very definitely that incorporation of soils knowledge and soil modifications to provide the food that these groups are looking to obtain. And of course, as we look over history, we see that that soil management has been identified as a real key to whether or not many of these civilizations have success over the long term or end up declining because of how those soils were managed, how they were treated. Just some brief examples of some of these. We look in Iraq, along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers down near the southern part of the country. There was a group of people who lived in those marshes, had a very sustainable agricultural system set up, low impact agriculture. They successfully practiced that method of agriculture for somewhere around 5,000 years. And you can see the picture right up here. You can see that we've got a hut on a small island, some fencing. You'll see some cattle over on that island. And these people in the marshes, they would pull sediments out of the canals around their houses, around these islands. They would use that sediment to build these islands up over time. And then they would use the manure from the animals to fertilize the soils on these islands. And then in the middle here, you can see we've got one of these people who has been out to an island where they are growing crops. And so they would harvest and bring those crops back in. It was low impact, but very much took advantage of their environment and a lot of the things that environment had to offer in terms of resources. And we have a number of civilizations out there that haven't lasted anywhere near 5,000 years. They kept things going for a very long period of time. Now you look there and you say, okay, so they kept it going for about 5,000 years. So it seems like it's ended. What happened? But you also see there's pictures here that are quite recent. In the 1980s, there were several dams that were put in place on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers as they went to create water storage in reservoirs, hydroelectric power generation, and those dams completely altered the hydrology of these marsh systems. And so we don't have nearly as many people that are able to live in this lifestyle in today's world as could have even 40 or 50 years ago because of alterations of the hydrology. And that's where the 5,000 years comes in this case. This lifestyle has declined considerably in the last few decades. But, for a very long time, from a human perspective, they kept this kind of thing going. A really classic work in this regards also is King's book, Farmers of 40 Centuries, which many soil scientists and agronomists are familiar with. But King went and took a look at the practices being carried out in places like China, Japan, Korea, and notice that while in many parts of the world, this has been a big problem with many parts of Europe, with parts of North America, we would come in, we would practice agriculture, we'd kind of start to wear the land out. He says, you go over to these East Asian countries and we can see where they've been able to successfully carry out agriculture, pretty intensive agriculture, for very prolonged periods of time. And one of the things that impressed King about these East Asian practices was that almost nothing organic went to waste. If you had an organic material, it was being utilized as food or as clothing. It was being returned to the land as a nutrient source. It was always cycling through this system, and something was always being done with that. Now, King did also realize, and also does say in his book, you can't just take what's happening in Eastern Asia and transfer to anywhere in the world. There are certain cultural aspects to this. There are certain climatic aspects to this that allow that particular system to work in that location. We go back and look at the marsh dwellers in Iraq, and obviously not every place in the world would allow you to make little islands, in marsh areas and carry out a low impact subsistence agriculture and live that way. Not everywhere has that environment. But we do look at things like this and we can see that we do have opportunities if we work with that environment to carry out these long-term sustainable examples of agricultural-based societies. On the flip side, of course, there is no shortage of examples of civilizations where soil degradation is looked at as one of the major reasons for civilization collapse. We have Rapa Nui, better known in the English world as Easter Island. And looking at that, Polynesians moved onto the island. It supported a fairly good sized population for several hundred years. But as time went by, it went from a forested, lush, vegetated state to a modern day state where there's almost no trees and it's very barren. And if you look at the archaeological record, there's evidence that what we had here was a situation where it became overpopulated, overexploited, and that system wasn't able to support what was being done on the island. And Mesopotamia, we go back to Iraq and further up the Tigris Euphrates rivers, we have really good examples of civilizations where they practiced an irrigated agriculture, ended up with salinization issues in fields, silting in of canals, irrigation canals, things of that nature that led ultimately to collapse of civilizations further north there in the modern day country of Iraq. So when we look at these management examples, kind of the takeaway lessons from this are, if we work with nature, we find the right way to do things, there are multiple civilizations that have found long-term sustainable solutions. But we also can look at a number of places where that wasn't done and we weren't able to carry out long-term sustainable production in those places where the environment wasn't understood and we didn't stay within those limits that the environment could support. When we look at soils, it's really important to understand that soil science actually evolved out of a number of other different related fields. And of course, we see this preserved to this very day in the traditional structure of soil science as a discipline. We have soil biology, we have soil chemistry, we have soil physics, so on and so forth, that make up our traditional structure. And that comes from biologists and chemists and physicists, geologists and geographers who worked in soils or with soils in the early days before soils really became a field, a discipline in and of its own right. There are some really well-known names that have been involved in studies of this type. For example, we got Bernard Palissy, Francis Bacon, or Robert Boyle. These are all scientists that are studied by, in many cases, by people who are looking at things like the history of chemistry. We've got Boyle's Law, for example, that pretty much everybody learns fairly early on in their scientific career. But these people were also looking at soils. And in the case of Palissy, Bacon, and Boyle, their focus was all on soil chemistry and how the whole plant nutrition into things worked. Makes sense. You've got chemists. Soil fertility has traditionally been very focused on chemical supply of nutrients to plants. And so there they are working with those kinds of issues. Leonardo da Vinci is somebody who was involved in early work in soils. He looked particularly at nutrient cycling. Da Vinci put together a pot experiment. He grew plants in pots and he tracked nutrients through the system in these potted plants that he had. When we think about Da Vinci, we tend to think about lots of things. We think about an amazing artist. We think about engineering designs that were way out far beyond his time. Things that sometimes it took hundreds of years, and all of a sudden they would appear, and we could actually use them. Things like the helicopter. But I wonder how many people think about Leonardo da Vinci and think, oh, soil science. But there he was. Now, of course, with these early scientists, there were two things going on. Certainly, there were people who were pretty impressive talents in terms of their intellect, who were very inquisitive, want to know what's going on around them. But you also have a situation where, of course, we have a lot less that's known in the world of science. And so if you want to chase a little bit of biology, a little bit of chemistry, and a little bit of geology or soil science or what have you, we don't have those same levels of knowledge base sitting there we have in a world like today, with all the things you have to learn to function in these fields in today's world. It'll be much more difficult to get that Renaissance person in the sense that they were, during the Renaissance. But it's very impressive to me that they were looking at so many different areas and getting engaged in this. Jethro Tull with soil management, and then Charles Darwin, another person. Of course, Darwin's name comes up, and people instantly think about biology, evolution. These are the things that come immediately to the forefront for most people and their minds when you talk about Charles Darwin. But Darwin has been referred to as the father of soil biology. He undertook some rather impressive studies of earthworms and how earthworms modify the soil. He also did some early sketches of soil profiles at a point in time when the whole soil profile concept didn't really exist, was very much in its infancy. And in fact, Dokuchayev references some of Darwin's work in regards to profiles, which Dokuchayev also worked with as he was doing his research that led in many ways to modern day soils. And so that brings us to Dokuchayev, and we widely recognize Dokuchayev and his work as setting the stage for our modern day world of soil science, the practice of soils, the study of soils as it exists today. And there are a number of reasons for that. First off is that Dokuchayev recognized soil as an independent natural body. There were a lot of people who were working with soil, studying soil, when Dokuchayev came around. We had chemists who were interested in the reactions that happen in soil and in soil fertility kinds of issues. We had the geologists type crowd who was interested in mapping of soils and soil formation and some of the things that we would refer to today as the pedologic side, the pedology side of our field. So it's not that people aren't working with soils when Dokuchayev comes around, but Dokuchayev looked at the soil from a completely different perspective. He didn't see it as just a place where chemical reactions were occurring, or just as something that was to be tilled and managed for crop production. He saw soil as an independent body in that natural environment. And that was the big kind of really that's why the single biggest breakthrough is that complete change in how soil is being looked at by someone who is studying it. If you look at the 5 soil forming factors that are still routinely taught in introductory soil science classes and such today, we can trace that back to Dokuchayev. His original work in 1882 included 4 of what we would include amongst the soil forming factors today. And before he was finished with his own work, he brought the 5th in to his picture of soils. He worked on soil profile concepts and on horizon nomenclature of the soil. As I said, he referenced some of what Darwin did in this regard. Now, Dokuchayev took the profile concept and horizon nomenclature in a bit different direction than Darwin was heading in. It wasn't that he just took Darwin's ideas and made them well known, but he was aware of the work Darwin was doing and that it was in a similar kind of vein. And he did acknowledge that as he developed his own concepts within this area. For someone like myself who comes from a background in podology, my formal soils training, and I'm very interested in mapping. Dokuchayev and his work was very important in terms of setting the stage for some of that soil mapping into things. And so for these reasons, this is who we widely recognize as the father of modern soil science. Now, that doesn't mean that Dokuchayev put together modern soil science all by himself. There were numerous other people at the time who were working on similar things or working with Dokuchayev. And in fact, I know that there are some historians of science who look at the idea of, the father of or founder of or original person doing kind of statement as not really being a great way to go when we talk about history. They say, nobody develops anything by themselves. It's a combination of the moment and the assimilation of ideas and all the different people that are out there. And there's a lot of truth to that. One good example of that idea was found right here in the United States. If you look back in 1960, and so we're talking about roughly 20 years before Darwin's big publications big publication that ended up, Darwin, before Dokuchayev's big publication that led to him being recognized as the father of modern soil science by many people. Hilgard was doing work in Mississippi that came up with many of the, or very similar conclusions to what Dokuchayev ended up publishing himself later on. And Dokuchayev was also aware of Hilgard's work. Dokuchayev cited Hilgard in some of the works that he produced. So, Hilgard was out there. In fact, Hans Jenny, who's not exactly a small name in soil science himself, he felt that Hilgard should be recognized as a co-father of modern soil science. And back in 1960, Jenny published an entire book where this wasn't the only argument in the book, but was very much a part of the argument that book put forth, and he went through and laid out, in quite a bit of detail, his case as to why this should be so. Now, we recognize Dokuchayev, like I said, at least if we look at what most soil scientists today who I talk to about this kind of stuff and have conversations with, you talk about, who's the father of modern soil science, it comes back around to Dokuchayev. And even with Jenny's efforts, we don't see Hilgard in that discussion. And you might say, well, why not? Why isn't Hilgard recognized for what he did? Which, he is recognized in today's world, but why isn't he recognized as that co-founder, something of that nature? And I think really as I look at it, as I think about it, I think the biggest part of that answer is that, while Hilgard was doing some really impressive stuff, it wasn't Hilgard's work that ultimately led to the major changes that we saw come about in our field. Hilgard published his work in a report of the Mississippi Geological Survey. He was the state geologist in Mississippi at the time that he did this. And that work was found in later years by soil scientists and recognized as going in a lot of these same directions that Dokuchayev had gone in. But by the time that was really widely recognized, widely disseminated, Dokuchayev's work had already been put out, and that paradigm change had already taken place, with Dokuchayev's work as the basis for that paradigm change. And of course, the other people that Dokuchayev was working with and was mentoring. So, we look at the history of our field and you say sometimes, okay, there's a really good idea that comes forth. and it just doesn't catch on. It's not quite the right time, wasn't presented in quite the right way. People didn't really notice it. Something happened that didn't just click. And I can think of another example of that. And this is just off the top of my head all of a sudden. But a few years ago, I edited a special issue of Geoderma, which actually Bradley was also worked on, was a co-editor on that issue. And Budaman Manasny and Alex McBratney posted a paper in there that took a look at digital soil mapping, and they flagged that same kind of phenomenon where a lot of the things that became digital soil mapping later down the road, there was somebody 20 years previously who was doing that same kind of thing, and it didn't catch on. It just wasn't quite the right time. So you look back, what we ended up with today, it was there. It would have come from what this earlier person was doing. It just wasn't their time for some reason. So some of science, some of history is timing. Where are you at when things are coming out, and does that catch on in that modern world? I'm going to switch over to America now and just kind of some major milestones here in the United States within our own history. 1899 was a major milestone for us because that is when the National Soil Survey, the organized National Soil Survey, began. In today's world, we kind of take it for granted that we can go to Web Soil Survey and we can pull up soils information for all kinds of locations all over the United States, and it's there, and there's it certainly isn't perfect, but we've got some standards and we can expect a certain level of product sitting there in front of us. But that obviously has not always been the case. And in 1899 is the first time that we had this vision being implemented for a national mapping of the soils here in our country, with Milton Whitney as the original person in charge of that effort. In the 1900s, we started to see soil erosion studies being conducted here in the United States. This is before the Dust Bowl. Of course, soil erosion studies got a lot of additional attention once the Dust Bowl hit. But between 1900 and about 1910, we saw a ramp up in soil erosion studies and an interest in trying to understand why soil moves and how we can keep more of our soil in place. The Dust Bowl just gave it a lot more urgency when we got to that point. The first academic program that was focused on soil studies here in the U.S. appears to have been put together at Cornell in 1903. Notice that we had an organized national soil survey before we had a soil science program in the United States. And in fact, it was the soil survey itself that was a major driving force in developing that Cornell program. There were some other schools that were also very early entries. We had Earlham College in Indiana that produced a number of early soil survey, big soil survey names. University of North Carolina, not North Carolina State, University of North Carolina produced a lot of early big names in soil survey. These were people that were taking advantage of what they saw as a new job opportunity for their students as this national survey got underway and took place. And in fact, a number of the people who worked on the early soil surveys were actually sent back to their home campuses. People like George Coffey going back to North Carolina, Jim Thorpe going back to Earlham College. They were sent back to help build those programs and develop people who could work in that organized soil survey. We saw a real formal focus on soil fertility studies begin also in the early 1900s, something that's probably, it's a foreign concept to us today, but in a lot of the very early days of agronomic studies and yield studies, they would carry out the studies and they didn't consider the soil they were growing the plants in. They were focused on fertilizer additions. They were focused on plant varieties, things like that. But they really weren't concerned about what the plant grew in. And they got some really anomalous results sometimes out of these fertility studies, because the soil wasn't an integrated part of the overall evaluation. The 1930s were a really big period here in the United States. That is when these ideas that Dokuchayev and his students and collaborators had been working on over in Russia, that's when they really made their way into mainstream soil science here in the United States. It was not the first time that people attempted to bring these ideas to the United States. We can look back. There was an individual named Firestone who made some attempts in prior to 1910 to introduce some, the Russian ideas here in the United States. George Coffey did something similar in the early 1910s. And then Marbot, who is pictured, he's the man on the taller man on the left, right here in the picture. I guess for the individuals in the picture, it'd be the right-hand side of those individuals, but as you look at it, it's your left-hand side. He started working in the mid 1910s and all the way into the 1930s to build support in the US for these ideas that he read about for the first time in a book that the fellow standing beside him, Konstantin Glinka, had translated into German back in the early 1900s, and that Marbot read German, did not read Russian, but read German. And so it was Glinka's translation of Russian work into German, and then, or publishing of it in German, and then Marbot's translation into English that finally got those ideas over here into the United States. So that was one of the major challenges we had in exchange of ideas in the early days of soil science. You get a lot of things being published in a wide range of different languages, and if you don't speak or read the language something's published in, you don't have access to it. And of course, there's no internet, so you couldn't just jump online and find something from Russia or Germany or Australia with some electrons at the click of a mouse. So made things a little more challenging in that regards. In 1933, now we're into the Dust Bowl. This is when the Soil Erosion Service came about. This later, the name was pretty rapidly changed, actually, to the Soil Conservation Service. I think it was Soil Erosion Service for 2 years, if I remember correctly. Then someone decided that we probably shouldn't advertise that we're trying to erode soil or imply that we're trying to erode soil, because it's the opposite that we're trying to accomplish. But the first chief of the Soil Erosion Service was Hugh Hammond Bennett, pictured here standing beside a stump with its roots exposed because of erosion during that Dust Bowl era. Now, the Soil Conservation Service at some point in time merged with Soil Survey here in the US. That would have been in the 1940s, if I remember correctly. And eventually, the Soil Conservation Service became what today is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. So this is the part of that early history of an organization that is very important to us to this day here in the US. Now, from 1951 to 1975, the Soil Conservation Service worked on soil taxonomy, the foundations of the classification system we have today. In the picture here, we have 3 individuals who were quite instrumental in that. On the far right-hand side of the picture, we have Guy Smith, who is widely recognized as being the chief architect of soil taxonomy. We also have right here, this individual in the dark suit is Charles Kellogg. He was in charge of the Soil Conservation Service at this point in time, and instrumental in providing the support necessary for soil taxonomy to take shape. Kellogg had been one of the co-authors on the soil classification system that soil taxonomy eventually replaced. They had had a very limited amount of time, 1 year, to put together that classification system and get it published. And Kellogg was determined that when the system got replaced, it would not be such a rushed job. So we went from 1 year to do it to 25 years to do it. Just a little bit of a difference in how fast things got done. Now, we did, of course, the seventh approximation was published in 1965, and SCS did start using soil taxonomy at that point in time, they started that transition over, but 75 was the quote unquote final version. And of course, we know that it continues to be modified to this day. Oh, and then the third person in the picture over here on the far left-hand side of the picture, this is Roy Simonson. We'll talk a bit more about Roy Simonson in a couple of minutes here, but Simonson was also deeply involved in the creation of soil taxonomy as a senior member of the Soil Conservation Service staff at that point in time. As we go into the middle part and later parts of the 1900s, there were a number of pedogenic models that were put forward that remain influential to various extents in our field today. Hans Jenny, who is the individual climbing the ladder there, taking a peek at the soils in this exposure. Hans Jenny published his functional factorial model in 1941 with his famous book, Factors of Soil Formation. And that is probably the single most influential model in soil science up to this point in time. In our history, we still use that model quite extensively. There are, of course, a number of other models that have come about to modify it or replace it or what have you, but and then they do get used by different groups, but it is still there and still being used. And in the world of science, when you're still taking that and running with it, some 80 years after it was first put forward, that's a rather impressive accomplishment in and of itself, that something is had that much duration. Roy Simonson, in the picture above there on the left-hand side, he proposed a process systems model in 1959. And actually, Simonson's model and Jenny's models are not necessarily exclusive of one another. They actually address different aspects of the soil forming system. Just very broadly, Jenny is focused on exterior factors that influence what we get in a given part of the landscape, whereas Simonson is focused on the internal processes going on within the pedon to create what we find at that particular point in the landscape. Just a couple of other models, and these are by no means inclusive, but Ed Runge published an energy model back in 1973. We have Johnson and Watson Stagnay, who put together an evolutionary model in 1987, and there are others. But this was a period of time in which that idea of modeling became a really important idea in soil science, and lots of people were putting their best efforts forward to try to describe just what it is that's going on in terms of soil formation. There are obviously many other models that aren't soil formation models that are out there as well. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through all the various kinds of models that are available in our world of soil science because we're running out of time already. In the 1950s, we start to see, as we go through the 1900s, especially the second half of the 1900s, we start to see soil science not move away from agriculture, but add on to agriculture. We've always been an important field for production ag, but as we get in the 1950s and move past, people start to realize there's a lot of things you can do with the soil information that isn't agriculturally dependent or agriculturally related. Land use planning, for example, environmental applications, things of this nature. And so the starting especially in the right about the 1950s or that time frame, we start to see soils really spread out and get a much broader base of use than what was there before. Near and dear to my heart, as we go from the 1930s up into the 1970s, we have development of soil geomorphology take place, and that's another one that we'll talk about a bit more in a couple of minutes here because there are some very strong ties between Iowa State and that entire soil geomorphology picture. In the 1940s, we start to see soils and human health relationships come into the picture. I'm showing my biases. I'm a pedologist, and I also work on soils and human health. So we get those kinds of histories. But here we have Selman Waxman, a soil biologist, was the first person. His lab was the first lab to successfully isolate antibiotics from soil microorganisms, and Waxman won the Nobel Prize for that, and was the first soil scientist, and for a very long time the only soil scientist to have been awarded the Nobel Prize. Across the 20th century, soil science became very internationalized, especially through what you might view as kind of the golden era of soils here in the United States, the 1940s or 50s up into the 1970s, 80s time frame. NRCS, or Soil Conservation Service, at that point in time had a lot of outreach to countries around the world. I know I've got friends that are from that period of time. Dick Arnold, for example, who spent a lot of time working with people in Russia, with people in Africa, with people all over the world, and really trying to understand soils from this big picture perspective. Whereas before this, soils have been very much like a national or regional approach, where we had a lot of focus on what this country has or this region has, but not so much on that bigger international, how does this all tie together kind of approach. This did begin to happen early in the 20th century with the organization of meetings by what would become the International Union of Soil Sciences in today's world, and the World Congress of Soil Science. In fact, the picture right there in the screen is a picture from the 1927 World Congress held right here in the United States. And that's a whole bunch of soil scientists out in the field on a World Congress field trip, taking a look at the soils in some portion of the United States. And that's also where that picture of Marbot and Glinka standing together came from. That picture was taken at that 1927 World Congress. So, but we get that internationalization taking place. Now I want to shift gears just a little bit. And again, if I miss your favorite Iowa State soil scientist, please don't throw tomatoes. There's way too many to choose from. But we do have plenty of people who have made significant contributions to soil science over the years that have connections to Iowa State. Roy Simonson being one of those individuals. Simonson was an Iowa State faculty member from 1938 until 1943. And who knows what he would have done and where things would have gone had he stayed with Iowa State. But unfortunately, he was lured away by Charles Kellogg and the Soil Conservation Service with the opportunity to see soils in many other parts of the country. And eventually, the world, I forget exactly where, I think it's Belgium, but this is a picture, this picture of Simonson is at one of these international trips where he's sitting on the edge of a soil pit. I think it's Belgium, if I remember right, but I actually got a letter from Roy Simonson at one point in time when I was a graduate student at Iowa State. I published my first history paper. It was on George Coffey, and I got a letter from Simonson congratulating me on the paper and telling me that encouraging me to continue working with the soil science history. And then when I graduated and I got my first job down in Georgia, Valdosta State University in Georgia, I got a second letter from Roy Simonson, and he said, "Now you're going to learn soils. You've seen them in North Dakota, you've seen them in Iowa, completely different in Georgia. Because this is good. Spread out, go see different soils." But that was kind of nice just as a grad student to get anything from someone like Roy Simonson, encouraging you to do much of anything. But he really valued that ability, or that chance to go out and see a lot of diversity. Once he left Iowa State, at Iowa State, I'm getting ahead of myself. At Iowa State, he was in charge of the soil survey program for the state of Iowa. And he also taught classes in soil morphology and genesis and related topics. Interestingly enough, another name that'll come up here in a minute is Charles Black, who was a well-known soil fertility specialist from Iowa State. And Charles Black took Simonson's morphology and genesis class as a student. And then I was reading something one time, a couple of years later, as a faculty member, Black came back and sat through Simonson's morphology and genesis class again. And Simonson asked Charles, he said, "Why did you come back and sit through an entire semester of morphology and genesis again. And Black's response was, because it's not the same class. Simonson was staying so on top of the field and was so involved in pushing the field that Black felt that 2 years later, Simonson had changed so much in his course, it was worth sitting through it for another round. Kind of speaks to his teaching, I think, that it was that much. It's tempting as a teacher to get a class prepped and not have to do it again, right? And that obviously wasn't Simonson's approach to teaching. But he was very widely respected internationally, very widely traveled, and had a very long career with the USDA, with Soil Conservation Service, once he moved on from Iowa State. And then I guess there's Charles Black's name right there again, where Simonson was one of his teachers. Black is, in fact, the next person on our list of soil scientists who have had significant influence, coming from Iowa State. As I go through the list here, it's more or less chronological, Simonson being the earliest of the ones I'm talking about, and moving up to more and more recent as we go through them. Black actually earned both his master's and PhD degrees at Iowa State, with a focus on soil fertility. And then he became a faculty member at Iowa State, was employed as a faculty member for 40 years, from 1939 through 1979. And he's a really big name in the history of soil fertility here in the United States. Something else that Black is noted for, some of you may be aware of the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology, based right there in Ames. And Black is actually viewed as the founder of CAST. And when he retired from Iowa State, CAST was founded in 1972. And Black served as a vice president for CAST at that point in time. And when he retired in 1979, he retired to go over to CAST and put his the bulk of his efforts into building CAST and its mission. Next name up is Don Kirkham. We can't talk about soils at Iowa State and not bring up Don Kirkham's name. Pretty big individual as well. He was on the faculty at Iowa State from 1946 to 1978. He was a soil physicist. His specialty was water flow through soils, including the drainage of water through soils. And he is recognized, or has been recognized by some, as the founder of mathematical soil physics. And that might sound like a really strange statement, because soil physics has to be mathematical, right? That's the whole point with physics. It's all based on math. But Kirkham brought a level of mathematical application into soil physics that apparently had not existed prior to his work. I've read things about Kirkham by people who are more of a soil physics expert than I am, who have referred to Kirkham as the single most influential soil physicist of the 20th century. And that's a pretty impressive statement to have made about you. There's not many people who are going to have that said about them, whether it's true or not, or there's arguments among different people as to, where that mantle falls. Just to have your name in that conversation is a pretty impressive compliment to the work you did. Kirkham also was a recipient of the 1983 Wolf Prize in Agriculture. And if you're not familiar with that prize, it's a pretty big deal in the world of agriculture. Some refer to that as the Nobel Prize of the world of ag. But it's a pretty heady recognition of the work that somebody puts into agriculture. Next one up, we're going to go back over to my personal biases. We got Robert Ruy and soil geomorphology. Ruy, in this particular case, is the fellow who is swinging off of the cable on the soil drill, you see right there. There's at least one other person in that picture that probably is known to a number of folks on the call. The guy at the controls is none other than Thomas Fenton, who had a long career there at Iowa State, and was my major professor in my time at Iowa State. The third individual on there is Wayne Dietz. But Tom told me one time that working in the field with Rui was exhausting, because Rui would work you hard all day. He was a go, 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 go guy. And then when you got back to the hotel at night, as all the young guys who were graduate students wanted to slump off to their hotel rooms and collapse into their beds, Rui wanted to go to the bar and drink all night and get no sleep. Then you take it back out in the field the next day and work you like a dog again. So he was known for being a taskmaster. But Rui was based at Iowa State. He officially worked for USDA, was based at Iowa State, and worked with Iowa State faculty. And there was a very purposely, Rui himself was a geologist. He was a geomorphologist. And he was very purposely placed at Iowa State to work with soil scientists on the soil geomorphology projects that the USDA conducted as a part of developing soil taxonomy. So Rui was at Iowa State from 1953 to 1970. There's all kinds of stories about Rui we don't have time to go into that were still floating around the department when I was there, and I know probably still floating around to this day. There's still a few folks around that remember those days. But that is his big spot in this discussion, is the contributions that he made to the development of soil taxonomy or soil geomorphology as a subfield of soil science and geology. And he also led work, and this actually was is what Tom did his PhD work on there at Iowa State, which Rui was very involved in. But Rui led work up in northeastern Iowa, and at that point in time, back in the 1950s and 60s, northeastern Iowa, they talked about what they called the Iowan Drift, these glacial deposits left behind by an Iowa advance of the ice. And it was Rui and his students who demonstrated that there was, in fact, no Iowa advance of the ice, but there was a different explanation for the deposits found up there in northeastern Iowa. The final person with connections to Iowa State that I'm going to bring up today is Mary Collins. Mary did her master's degree in 1977, or received her master's in 1977, received her PhD in 1980 there at ISU. What I bring Mary up for here is a bit of breaking that glass ceiling. Mary is the first individual, the first woman elected as president of the Soil Science Society of America. And Mary was very active in soil science at a time when there weren't a whole lot of women in the world of soils. So that's that itself, I think, is an impressive, accomplishment, being that first person, that first woman to lead our main professional society here in the United States. And Mary had a long career at the University of Florida, where she retired a few years ago as a full professor from the University of Florida. So that is my talk for you today. Just the slide here is just the main references that I used to put together the materials that I talked about this afternoon. And I think I left at least a little bit of time, if I understand things right. I think we go to 4:15. Is that correct, Brad?
Actually only to 5, but I think that's okay.
Oh, it's a 5. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh no. Oh, I'm sorry. In your world, it's 5. In my world, it's 4 o'clock right now.
Oh, right. Yeah, I forgot the time. But I think as far as timing, as long as you want to stick around and people have questions, I don't see any reason to cut it off.
Okay. Yeah. If someone has questions, I can hang around for a few minutes here and answer some questions if they're out there.
Yes, Eric, I have a question. I am with the USDA here in Ames, Iowa, with what used to be the Soil Tilth Lab. Superb presentation, really interesting. I enjoyed it. I have a question, and you're right, who we are today is in part what came before us. History is very important. Tinkering going on constantly. I have a question about our classification systems. Dokuchayev, as you pointed out, had this enormous influence on things. And I think one would attribute to him this zonal classification, right? Mollisols are found in prairies and alpha sols in forest soils. My understanding from Francis Hole, the late pedologist from Wisconsin, is that the US system is much more based on what are the properties of the soil, not so much genesis, but not where did it form, but what is it today? So you would have a mollisol in a desert if it fits the classification for what a mollisol is.
Right.
So he said there's a minor thread of genesis in it, but it's mostly what is the soil itself. So what is the history behind that? That's a pretty sharp break from Dokuchayev's zonal model. How did we end up in the US with this system? Was it a personal preference of those key individuals whom you identified? Or is it something more American than that as to why if you agree that we did deviate from the previous model?
Oh no, I do agree we deviated from that previous model, and of course a lot of soil scientists here in the U.S. that advocate for soil taxonomy would argue that to an extent that that genetic aspect is embedded in the fact that we describe the properties, and the properties are a result of the genesis. But I mentioned in passing that Kellogg had been a co-author of the previous system. It was Baldwin, Thorpe, and Kellogg back in I think it was 1938. I believe is when they published that previous system in the Yearbook of Agriculture. They had put forward a classification system that was very heavily influenced by that zonal concept with soils. And they couldn't make it work. Now, does not able to make it work mean that the zonal approach doesn't work, or does it mean that they couldn't make it work with what we were doing here in the United States? Because one of the things that always was a problem with that 1938 system was, how do you get from the big picture zonal soils, kind of at what we call the order level in today's world, that that big picture of our soils in their classification, how do we get from there down to the series? And the 1938 system didn't have any good way of doing that. In fact, none of our previous classification systems had really had a good way to go from the most general classification down to the most specific classification. And when they sat down to put together soil taxonomy, the framers of taxonomy were given very few absolute you must do's with taxonomy. But one of the absolutes they got, according to Guy Smith in some interviews that he did back in, I think it was 1980s, they got published in Soil Survey Horizons. One of the absolutes that they could not get away from is that this new system could not abandon the soil series, and it had to work the soil series into the classification. And so a part of where this system comes from is that this system incorporates the series. Now, they also, you got to remember too, 1950s and moving on in that period of time when taxonomy was being put together, there was a strong move towards quantification in soil science. And so taxonomy also does a really good job, if you will. I guess you can argue it was a good job or a bad job, but soil taxonomy is very focused on quantification. To be a molecular pedon, it must be so thick, it must have so much organic carbon, it must have this Munsell soil color. It really gets quantified. But I think combinations of things like that are what led to that departure from the zonal approach.
Very good, thanks. It's very, very interesting. Thanks so much.
I see that Dr. Manu has a question, I think.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Yeah, Dr. Brevik, during our students' days, and I was working at the soil survey lab, and that little thing between the Sea Science building and the soil of the building. We work with a lot of NRCS giants like Tom DeWitt, Ron. Can you say something about those guys? Because they were really, really, really out there in the field doing some of the greatest mapping, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, the one that I really worked with, of course, at Iowa State was Tom Fenton.
Mm-hmm.
And Tom was, and still is, he's still alive, but going out in the field with Tom was an amazing experience. One of the things that would blow my mind, we go out there and we'd take a sample, we'd dig a hole, or we'd take a core, and it'd come up, and Tom would look at it and go, "That's a 10YR42." And myself and one of the other grad students, we'd be getting out our 1-cell books, we'd checking everything out, and we'd decide on what we thought it was, and that's a 10YR42. It was kind of amazing the way he'd look at the soil and say, "There's the color." And he almost always got the same answer we got with our color books when he would do that. Or I remember being out in the field one time with Tom, kind of a funny Tom story. We had a visiting Russian scientist, and so we were out in the field doing some sample collection. Tom wanted to dig a couple of big pits. We took a number of cores, but Tom wanted a couple of good big pits to do descriptions in. And there's like two of us, like 20-something-year-old grad students standing there, and Tom only brought one shovel, and Tom's down there shoveling away, digging this pit, and myself and Lewis looking at each other going, "This is embarrassing. I mean, we're watching our 60-year-old major professor dig a hole in front of this Russian scientist, but he won't give us the shovel." But yeah, no, working with Tom, absolutely amazing experience for me to have that opportunity.
Thank you.
I think Dr. Miller has a comment that he would like to share with us.
Okay.
Great, Eric, great presentation and good review of some of our history. I just want to add a comment that's not published, but it was information passed on. As you pointed out, Dr. Simonson was on our faculty from 38 to 43. And then of course he was followed by obviously one of the real giants in Iowa soils, Dr. Frank Rieken, who was both Tom and my major professor. And Dr. Rieken came on from the university. He's originally of Saskatchewan, and he did his work at University of Illinois and came over when Dr. Simonson left, came over in 1943 and was on the faculty until he retired in 1975. But the story I want to share is that that's not published, relating to the seventh approximation and soil taxonomy. In the 40s, prior to the building of the first edition of the current agronomy hall, which was opened in 1951, the agronomy department was in Curtis Hall. And at that time in the 40s, Guy Smith was located in Ames, and he and Dr. Rieken did field work. And I'm sure you're aware of their publication, Soils of Iowa, the Redbound book. Which I'm sure you have a copy of.
Yes, it was right over there.
So they would, as I said, the agronomy department is located in Curtis Hall, and they would walk over to the Union, which not a very far walk, for their coffee. And one day during coffee and on the walk back to Curtis Hall, Guy was having these conversations and trying to figure out how he took Dr. Kellogg's classification system and upgraded it and developed it and what it did. And what Dr. Rieken said to him, and I can just see Dr. Rieken with that cigar hanging out of his mouth. He said to Guy, he said, "Well, Guy, why don't you just throw it away and start over?" And so Dr. Rieken told that story that was really what Guy Smith did. He just decided to walk away from from Kellogg's classification and throw it away, move it off his desk and start over. And that's what he did. And we got the seventh approximation. I just will correct you. The seventh was published in 1960, not 1965.
Oh, okay. Yep.
I started.
Well, I think, and I may be wrong, but I think 65 is when they actually adopted it, though.
Right,
Started
you're
being
correct.
used.
I worked as a student trainee with SCS in 1961, and my party chief gave me a copy of the pre-pub, and I probably still have that somewhere in my file. But anyway, I wanted to share that story with you because I think that's a great story about what can happen over coffee and a walk back between the Union and Curtis Hall. And really enjoyed your presentation, Eric. Great to see you. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Good to see you too. Yeah, it's and one of the things talking about the seventh approximation, one of the things that most surprised me when I first really sat down and read the seventh approximation, I was surprised by how much change happened between that and the 75 release of taxonomy. I mean, it's certainly, you can see the bones of soil taxonomy in the seventh approximation, but the 75 release is not just an editing and a brush up. There's some pretty significant change even between those two documents. And I'm glad you brought up Dr. Ryken. There's Fred Trobe, and like I said at the beginning of the talk, I'm going to talk about 5 people, but there are so many people that have gone through Ames that have had very impressive soil science careers, and Dr. Ryken is certainly another one of those.
And Eric, while I've got it, I just remind you, Guy Smith is a native of, I think, Atlantic, and our friend that you just mentioned him, he retired. Dick Arnold was also native of Union County near Creston. So not only did they spend time at Iowa State, but they also had a pretty deep Iowa roots.
Yep. Well, and not an Iowa connection directly, but Roy Simonson, we're rather proud up here. He's a native North Dakotan.
Yes, and I'm now in Michigan, and I found out that Charles Kellogg was born on a farm about 40 miles from where I live.
Yep.
In Ionia County, Michigan.
Yep. So, and those kinds of, I always find those kinds of little facts about these people to be really neat to find, you know, where they came from, that kind of thing. I enjoy that. So.
Are there any other comments for Dr. Brevik before we hang this up?
Just seeing Rick Cruz typed one in, but yeah, saying it's a much nicer visit with me this time. And yeah, we had both been in a meeting in Barcelona, and he got his pocket picked. Actually, I was impressed. Rick realized it happened and got his wallet back, and just lost a little bit of cash, if I remember right, out of the wallet. Not a small amount, but didn't lose the entire wallet and the credit cards. But yeah, a little more pleasant than getting your pocket picked.